Welcome to Climate Quickies, bite-sized nuggets of climate goodness from our TEDxLondon experts in under 5 minutes.
In this week's Climate Curious, we're celebrating a historic headline that the UK is banning new oil and gas exploration. But what does this really mean? Especially for projects like Rosebank and Cambo oil fields that are still pending. On why this is a win for ensuring a livable future and how to ensure a fair transition for the communities that rely on this industry, here's the Executive Director of Uplift, Tessa Khan. Stay curious.
Hi, my name's Tessa Khan. I'm the Executive Director of Uplift, and I want to talk about the fact that there was a historic moment in the UK a couple of weeks ago when the government announced that it would ban new oil and gas exploration licensing. So the UK is Europe's second largest oil and gas producer. We're a country that extracts about 1 million barrels of oil and gas a day from the North Sea. And we know that if we're going to have a safe climate, we simply cannot afford to add more oil and gas to the existing oversupply of fossil fuels that exist in the world. And so 2 weeks ago, the UK government, recognising the climate emergency and the importance of aligning our approach to fossil fuels with that, announced that it would no longer be issuing new licences to explore for oil and gas in the North Sea, which is the first time a country that is such a large oil and gas producer, such a large economy, has ever done this. So it means that unlike for the previous decades, where we've had almost annual licensing rounds where companies can apply to explore for new oil and gas in the North Sea off the UK's coast, that is no longer going to happen. What the UK government has said is that there are currently hundreds of oil and gas fields that are already producing oil and gas, that are employing thousands of people across the country, that those fields will continue to operate and that there will be some limited development of those fields to kind of extend their lifetime, but that there aren't going to be any companies that are allowed to find brand new resources to add them, as I said, to the existing stockpile of fossil fuels that we can no longer burn. I think it's a massive turning point because it's also about the government and us, the public, finally confronting the power of the oil and gas industry. So this is an industry that is used to having gotten its way in the UK for so many years, to the point that the oil and gas regulators' legal objective was to maximise economic recovery of offshore oil and gas. Like, that's been the case right up until now, despite, the Paris Agreement, despite governments recognising that there's a climate emergency. Finally, that's changed, and the oil and gas industry recognises and has been told that the writing is on the wall, that it now has to plan for what comes next. And most importantly, we have to make sure that the people who work in that industry, the supply chains, the communities that are particularly in the northeast of Scotland that have relied on that industry for their livelihoods for so many years, that they're taken care of, that, the focus now shifts to what comes next and not on continuing to dig ourselves into this hole of more oil and gas. This is a victory for the climate movement. This is the result of a huge amount of public pressure that I think really started to escalate a few years ago. You might remember there was a massive campaign to stop the Cambo oil field, which was successful. There was also a call that came from right across the country for there to be a windfall tax on the oil and gas industry a few years ago when it was making huge profits and people were struggling to pay their energy bills. We also succeeded in getting that. This is really about the fact that the government has heard so clearly and so consistently from people all across the country that we cannot have more oil and gas, if we want a safe climate, that it is not in our interests to continue propping up a declining industry, and that we've got to, as I said, plan for what comes next. And I think we were relieved because it's just such a common sense, reasonable decision. This is the kind of policy making that shouldn't come as a surprise. As I said, it's clear that that's what's needed in terms of the climate science and making sure we stay within safe climate limits. More oil and gas in the UK also doesn't contribute to our energy security because most of what's left to drill for is oil, and we end up exporting the vast majority of that. We know it doesn't bring down people's energy bills. We know that jobs in that sector have been been declining for years anyway. So, more exploration licensing just doesn't benefit the public at all. All it does is increase the profits of the oil and gas industry. So, we really think that this is a sensible decision by the government. What the government announced a couple of weeks ago is about banning new licenses to explore for oil and gas. So that's kind of one category of oil and gas projects that will definitely no longer go ahead. On the other hand, there are some projects that received their exploration licenses many years ago. The Rosebank oil field, the Cambo oil field are examples of those. And they've been waiting for the government to basically give them the final consent to start producing. So they're not covered by the ban that was announced. And so what we now have to do is make sure that the government doesn't approve those fields. The same arguments apply. You can't have a major new oil field in a safe climate. It's not doing anything for the public. It's just enriching these oil and gas companies. So we've got to keep the pressure on to make sure that the government now says no, in particular to the Rosebank oil field. It's one thing to manage the decline of these industries because we know that they can't exist at the scale that they do if we're going to stay within safe climate limits. But it's just as important to make sure that the people who work in those industries, the communities that have relied on them, aren't in any way made victims of that transition and that they're supported. Now, we're incredibly lucky in the UK that we have this massive offshore wind industry. Renewable energy is obviously the path that we need to go down for a safe climate, for energy security and for affordable energy. And so what the focus of the government now needs to be on is making sure that people are supported in terms of the skills training that they have, the pathways that are available to them to pivot into those alternative industries so that, we make sure that this is a transition that happens not just in a way that's good for the climate, but that's also fundamentally fair.
Thanks for listening to this quickie.
This episode was created by our superstar podcast team at TEDxLondon. Until next time,
stay curious.